Hello and welcome. I'm Scott Hargreaves, Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs. I'm in the Baillieu Myers studio, their headquarters in Melbourne, and we have a very special guest today. I'm sure you'll enjoy this interview. Before I introduce him, I'll introduce my colleague, Dr. Bella Debrera, Director of the IPA's Foundations of Western Civilisation program. It's our great pleasure to host today István Kiss, who is the Director of the Danube Institute in Budapest, who is visiting Australia with some of his colleagues. First of all, István, apologies for butchering the Hungarian language, but I hope I got that close enough.
No worries, I think you did a very good job actually, so thank you for having me.
Great. And so perhaps what we might do first of all is just if you could tell our viewers briefly about the Danube Institute, and then we'll launch into a discussion about what the world looks like from Budapest as opposed to what it looks like from Melbourne.
So the Danube Institute was actually established in 2013 to be what we like to call a beltway between Hungary and, broadly speaking, the region and the Anglosphere of people and ideas. Mostly on the center right, but we do regularly have people who are on the other side of the spectrum, especially if they are common sense persons or people and have common sense views. So we have been trying to achieve this with three broad things, of course, events. We do have about 2 events per week with the exchange of people, so we have visiting fellowships, and with joint research projects with like-minded institutions. Most of our, I would say, research is focused on geopolitics, but we do have a research group which is looking at Christian democracy. Is there such a thing? Could it be an alternative to liberal democracies? And we also have a research group which is focusing on persecuted Christians in Africa and the Middle East. Other than that, in events, we are doing a lot of things, so that's much broader, from culture to history to, again, geopolitics. We like to deal with a lot of things which we think are interesting in the 21st century and also which might be important or relevant to our future.
Yeah, no, a great program of events, and congratulations. In only that 10 short years, you made quite an impact, and first, I think, came on my radar when Tony Abbott made a speech at the Institute a couple of years ago, and that's where Tony's a distinguished fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs, and he recounted his so-called meeting with Vladimir Putin, which was challenging for Tony but fascinating to the listeners, subsequently published in Quadrant. And so doing great work in culture and with the research and events program. What I thought we might do, István, is start off with a comment that I well recall. At the time, it was nearly just over 20 years ago, at the time of the Iraq War. Donald Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defence under George W. Bush, and he was in a press conference when he was trying to round up support for the Iraq War, and the interviewer said, "Well, you haven't really got the support of the Europeans, have you?" And he just shot straight back to the journalist and said, "Well, are you talking about the old Europe or the new Europe?" And he said, "Now you're thinking of Europe as Germany and France. I don't. I think that's old Europe. If you look today at the entire NATO today, the centre of gravity is shifting to the east, and there are a lot of new members. And if you just take the list of all the members of NATO and all of those who have been invited in recently, 26, something like that, you're right. Germany has been a problem and France has been a problem." And then he goes on, obviously, to talk about the countries of what had formerly been Eastern Europe. And he was just reminding everyone that the world was changing. And for me, as a distant observer, it was almost like a reframing, finally, after the end of the Cold War, some years on, obviously, that it's not just Eastern Europe beyond some pale. This is Europe. And we were really reconnecting with the past. So I don't know how that felt at the time, but has that been a process that you've observed over the years as you suddenly find yourself back on the world stage?
Yes, and I think that's increasingly true today, of course, with the war happening, but also before, because the so-called Visegrad countries, which is Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, have in the past recent years had much higher GDP growth and much more success than a lot of Western Europe. So there's a lot of talk about how this region might be kind of the motto for the future economic growth of Europe. These remarks make us very happy because I think most people don't know, but that region, we don't consider ourselves Eastern Europe, so we prefer a term Eastern Central Europe, which would basically mean that we're the eastern part of Central Europe, and Central Europe would be, of course, Austria and Germany. We feel that we have been an integral part of Western civilization until, I would say, 500 years ago, when because of the Ottoman conquest we have been cut off. When again with the Austro-Hungarian Empire we kind of came very close to being reintegrated to the Western civilization, but sadly again when the Soviets came and communism happened in our countries, we've been cut off perhaps even more than during the Ottoman times, so there was a very brutal cut off from Western civilization, and that's why we were very happy when we could join the European Union and NATO, because we felt that there's a kind of a historic justice. But finally we are once again part of the Western world, of Western civilization, where we think we very much belong, but from which we have been sadly cut off during periods of our history. And it's kind of refreshing to see that now this region can bring promise to Europe, and quite honestly sometimes feels more European than some parts of Western Europe.
Yeah. Actually, I was going to say, you've gone from being sort of cut off from Western Europe and Western civilization to being what we see now as a beacon of Western civilization. Everything that we used to have in Australia and that we used to value and appreciate as the benefits and the fruits of Western civilization are rapidly disappearing. And from a distance, we're looking across at Hungary and going, they actually have Western civilization in their hands, and they're propagating it, and it's become now the center of Western civilization. And it's very tempting just to want to actually leave Australia and go and live in Hungary, because things are so diabolically woke here. That we are now looking at Hungary as a beacon of hope, which is extraordinary because that's only happened in the last 20 years. How have you influenced this resurgence of Western civilization in Hungary?
Well, without wanting to sound pig-headed or overly confident, I would like to think that we did play a role in this. Of course, there's other institutions. I think our kind of conservative movement realized after some election losses in the early 90s and the 2000s that it needs to build up its civic and think tank base. And actually, since we have a conservative government in power from 2010, they have actually very purposely tried to build up this conservative civil sector, think tank sector. So there's a very flourishing think tank scene in Hungary, not just with Danube, but with other institutions. Of course, they might have different focuses. Our focus has mostly been the Anglosphere, and I think in that regard, we have been fairly successful. We had a lot of good speakers, visiting fellows, and I think some important events. Just to name a few, Rod Dreher has been working with us for the past couple of years now. Actually, you mentioned Tony Abbott. He's been a visiting fellow since
Christopher
September.
Rufo.
Christopher Rufo was a visiting fellow. So I think we had over a really good intellectual people from very diverse backgrounds, from former politicians to journalists to academics, and try to kind of shake up things in Hungary, so shake up the cultural and think tank sphere in Hungary, but also in part try to bring some of these ideas into the Anglosphere and share some of these ideas with our friends in America, the UK, and now hoping more increasingly in Australia as well.
Well, again, that's rediscovering that idea of conversations taking place right across Europe. It's certainly Australia, having English as our first language is a blessing and a curse, because all our international news comes via London and Washington and the west coast of the US. So we have a very Anglo-centric view of the world. Everything is sort of filtered through that English-speaking mindset. So the work you're doing, I think, is important to balance that. What happens on the campus of Harvard or the campus of Berkeley is not the be-all and end-all of Western civilization, and thank God for that, because it's a very depressing picture, and we need to know that that there are other people working in much older traditions with scholarship. And so I think that outreach to the Anglosphere has been a very positive thing.
Yes, as I said, we've been trying to do our best. And also to come back some of your comments, I still think that most of the Anglosphere, if you would look at the everyday citizens of Australia or America, these people are still very common sense people, and I think are actually fairly conservative. So I'm kind of surprised that there's no more electoral victories from the conservative side in some of these countries, but I guess it might be due to the fact that some of these parties are not very conservative in their policies, sadly, or once they came into power, they kind of are afraid to implement conservative policies, and I think that's kind of sad, but we're there to kind of show the way and show that in Hungary at least there has been a conservative government for 14 years, which I think has some things to show to the world, policies which seems to be successful, unlike sadly our friends in the United Kingdom, where you have a conservative government for the same time, but I sadly don't really see the conservative policies implemented there.
No, and partly this has been I'd be interested in your views and Bella's views, but it's perhaps the difference is a failure to deal with culture and a failure to deal with to build up the institutions of civil society. So we absolutely agree that mainstream Australians are very sensible people. They're not necessarily ideologically big C conservatives, but of a conservative disposition. I mean, we're egalitarian. Family comes first. We believe in self-reliance. Of course, government's there to do things. We like roads, and various things, and we like our potholes to be filled in. But the trouble is when conservatives are approaching governance, they're faced by this wall of universities, taxpayer-funded broadcasters like the Australian Broadcasting Commission, taxpayer-funded arts institutions. We've had a recent experience with the Sydney Theatre Company where the actors took it upon themselves to make a stand in support of Palestinian state.
There's a happy ending to that one, though.
Yes, and there is, and on stage at the end of a performance. But this is the world that we live in, and it sort of spooks the conservatives. And I'm very attracted to the idea of new institutions which can be sponsored by the state, but which provide some kind of counterbalance to that, as you've demonstrated.
Agreed, and I think that's kind of coming from the differences of our history. So you have been luckier, I guess, during your history because you never had communism, while sadly we had.
We're working on it.
Yeah, don't worry, we're getting there.
That's why I think sadly you don't necessarily see some of these tendencies. You of course do, but a lot of everyday people will not see because you were fortunate enough to not have that. But in Hungary, we see these tendencies, and it makes us think because we have saw them in the past, and I fully agree. So if you think about it, Hungary was in a far worse situation. So after the fall of communism, because it was a bloodless revolution, because we made a compromise with the communists, basically all the economic power, all the cultural power, all the academia, all the media was in their hands, and it took almost 30 years to build up a kind of a counterbalance for that, and it's still not 100%. So if I would look at Hungary, I would say that in the culture, the left still has much more power than the right. In media, I would say it's becoming 50-50, but it also depends on the platform. So on online media is still very much ruled by the left.
So can I just ask about academia? So how many of the academics do you think are still culturally left in universities in Hungary? And how do you stop them then sort of influencing the younger generations?
I would say the majority is still left-wing, but we're, I think, lucky in a sense that most of the woke policies have not really penetrated the academia. So in left, I'm talking about kind of old-fashioned left-wing policies who are following big state, have kind of more culturally left-wing ideas, but are not necessarily indoctrinated in Vogue culture. Also because, I mean, Hungary, again, because of its history, doesn't really have, how should I say, a role in this. So we don't really feel that we should be sorry for colonization
they can't get you on colonization.
Or racism, because we never had slavery, we never had colonies. So luckily, it's kind of harder to penetrate Hungarian intelligentsia because...
You might be asking the Soviets for some reparations, or the Ottomans perhaps.
Well, I would be very happy to do that, but sadly that's not really common for the time being. But yeah, I mean, sadly that kind of shows some of the ridiculousness of these claims, because I think most people did suffer during some periods of their history. So most people could claim from other people or nations reparations for injustices done, but most nations just don't do that.
I might come back, actually. I hadn't been planning this, but you mentioned the Visegrad countries, and I mean, we shouldn't forget the economics, because there's this narrative, again, you find this in the Anglosphere, propagated through the universities, that, oh yes, well, Poland under the previous government and Hungary under the current government of these, dreadful authoritarian regimes, but actual authoritarian regimes are always in the business of, directing the economy, and it's all about the state. Whereas the economic performance, as you say, has actually been quite impressive. And I saw some figures the other day that comparing Poland and England, and Poland has outperformed significantly, and I think the GDP per capita of Poland is now well in front of that of England. So it's, this is no small thing to have managed that transition out of communism to establish a more or less market-based society, and to have had some success. So what have been some of the keys to doing that?
Well, actually, it has been very difficult to do that, and I'm still not sure that it has been successful 100%. But each and every country had a very different story, and I think in hindrance, Hungary made a mistake. So Hungary was what was called the goulash communism of kind of the Eastern Bloc, which meant that we had a revolution in '56, which was brutally put down by the Soviets and the local communists. And afterwards, a couple of years from there, they realized that they cannot rule Hungary as they did before, so they started the process of liberalization. And because of this, Hungary was one of the not as liberal as, let's say, Yugoslavia, which was not part of the Eastern Bloc, but still communists, but under the kind of Warsaw Pact countries, Hungary was the most free. And also kind of the best students, so to speak. And I think our political elites wanted to keep that on in the 90s, and we kind of blindly followed most of the neoliberal economic policies which they were recommending for us. So we did the shock therapy, which I think in hindrance was a mistake. So most of these companies, because of the background deals made during the transition process, actually were in the hands of former communist apparatchiks. And these people sell these companies for nothing to Western European or American companies because they still made a profit. But those companies were not interested in actually keeping these companies or investing in them. They just wanted the market. So most of our kind of biggest companies, industries have been closed down in the 90s because these investors were not looking at actually investing in them just for the market. Poland didn't make this mistake, so their kind of economic shift was much slower. And in the 90s, that seemed to be a mistake because their GDP dropped down further. It was more difficult. But in hindrance, now they have successful national companies. While Hungary is getting there. So during the current government, there actually has been policies and support to kind of help to make these national champions. Of course, that is part of why Orbán is hated by some in the West, because he was actually stepping on some of their economic interests. So I think that started kind of the hostilities towards Orbán. And of course, when the migration crisis and other ideological things happened. But I think in the very beginning, it was actually a lot of economic interest which Orbán was kind of stepping on. A very good example is that, for example, they privatized the whole gas network system. And, we are heavily reliant on Russian gas. And in the 2000s, when again they had conflict with Ukraine, they actually turned off the gas. And the funny thing is that we had these huge gas reserves, but they were in the hands of a French company who actually sold that gas reserves to other European countries while we didn't have gas. So when the current government went in, they basically bought out the French. They restated the gas system, and of course that hurt a lot of economic interests. But now, when we have a situation like this, we actually have a lot of gas reserves. And you might agree or disagree on this, but I do think that in the kind of the sake of national interest, it's sometimes important to have some form of state involvement.
Yeah, and the IPA is very much a free market institution, and the market has served Australia very well, and privatisation actually served Australia well in the wave that we saw in the 80s and 90s, but that was at a time when the world was liberalising, international trade was on the increase, but we're now in a period where supply chains are being disrupted. We find ourselves facing these questions, not so much of, there's no such thing as national self-reliance in the sense of, I think that's what they're aiming for in North Korea.
Yeah.
But certainly,
and they tried it in India and I think in Argentina, Brazil, but usually quite backfired.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it's not about trying to do everything at home, but there are increasingly a need to sort of think through what would that mean in our energy system. Again, we have private companies and we can maintain that, but what is the role of the state in directing that? At the moment, say in energy, the history of the last 20 years has been the obsession with climate change, whereas the IPA's obsession is with energy security. If we don't have secure, reliable energy for households, for businesses, we can't have a manufacturing sector. It's driving up prices to households. So that's sort of the national interest that we're trying to face. So there's echoes of that, and of course with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the gas prices globally went through the roof, and some of that blew back to Australia as well.
Well, Hungary suffered terribly because of that. I guess the whole region, but Hungary particularly, because Hungary is a landlocked country. So I think only Slovakia and Hungary, partly the Czech Republic as well, but they have more connections towards Germany and Poland in energy. So I think Hungary and Slovakia has been hit far worse by outside of Ukraine. Actually, I think we got far more hurt than Russia, because Russia sadly has been kind of finding loopholes in the sanction system, but also, not just the loopholes, they are very happy to sell gas and oil to China and India, who are very happy to buy them. And going back to the free market argument, I fully agree. So coming from a post-communist country, I think most things should be ordered by the market. But I think that is kind of a scale. So you do need some form of government in that scale, and I think that actually that kind of differentiates between countries and history. So I agree. I think in the 80s we needed much less state, but I'm not sure that's the case now. Perhaps we need a bit more state, or at least stronger states in a sense, which are willing to intervene when necessary. And I think COVID, as you mentioned, and the supply chain showed that. So I think it was kind of a disgrace that Western societies couldn't produce masks, or in America you didn't have baby formula, which is just utterly ridiculous. Why would we need China to make baby formula or masks? Those are pretty simple things. So I think perhaps globalization has went a bit too far, and I would really like to live in this happy new world where every state is kind of benign and works together and loves each other, but I'm not sure that's actually realistic. But also if it is, it's very far far away on the road. And in this case, I think countries have to be prepared to at least have some form of self-reliance, which shouldn't be North Korea or some of these other countries, but at least have a kind of a reliance on some food products and have like a lot of venues to get energy and oil. And Hungary has been struggling with that because being a landlocked country and also a small country with limited resources, kind of finding an alternative to Russian gas has been a struggle in the past 30 years. Which is still ongoing. We still don't really know what is going to be the solution. We are trying to make deals with Azerbaijan, with Central Asia, but without the pipelines in place, which Hungary doesn't have the resources to finance, it's almost impossible.
Yeah, which and unfortunately those decisions were made 20 years ago. Which allowed, with the connivance of the Germans, which allowed Russia to dominate that market. You could have actually built alternative pipelines.
As Hungary was actually supporting that, but as you mentioned, sadly the Germans were very happy to get cheap Russian gas and never kind of, They
didn't think about the alternative sources of supply and the balancing of the Russian. Oh, I really am digressing. Bella, you might have some questions.
Well, no, I have some questions, but it's not necessarily about energy. I guess I just wanted to know, would most voters be conservative as they are in Australia, but perhaps more overtly conservative as Scott mentioned, they're kind of, people are small c conservatism, that they think of the family as being important and hard work and the sort of what we associate with a conservative way of life. But would they be more, are the Hungarians more aware of the dangers of not fighting the left on the encroaching sort of damage that the left can cause society because they've been through communism? Are they more aware of the dangers, do you think, than the Australian public?
I think that's partly true, and I think that because our right-wing movement has been very divided in the 90s. And of course we needed a strong leader like Orbán, who's a very talented politician in this sense, to bring these people together. But I think it was also the shock that if we don't stick together, the former communists will come back into power, which actually happened. So 4 years after the regime change, actually the former communists, which now call themselves socialist, came back with an absolute majority, which I think shocked people. Then the first Fidesz government, which again was a coalition government, lost out in a very close election to, again, the former communists who sided then with the so-called liberals, but they were not very liberal, siding with the former communists. And I think that kind of those shocks really kind of convince people. And of course we need, as I said, a good leader as well to kind of stick together and kind of come to Fidesz and have Fidesz as this kind of big tent centre-right party. And I think it was fairly successful in a lot of other European states. Sadly, it hasn't been. So we can see it in Italy, in Spain. In the Netherlands, it's just terrible. But you have all these different kind of right-wing parties, and they never really come together.
They don't understand how you need to be united.
And I think in Hungary, because of our past, we kind of realized that if we don't stick together, so we had the agrarian party, we had more liberal conservatives, more national conservatives, so Christian Democrats, and all of these, except kind of the very far right, we still have a far right party, merged into Fidesz slowly. And with the voters, I think there is an element of truth in that, but I still think, as everywhere, voters actually care mostly about their pockets and how they feel.
István, you mentioned the war, so let's go there. And I might just remark, so you've had Tony Abbott at the Institute, who is a very, very strong supporter of a strong Western response, a strong NATO response, a strong Australian response to the Russian invasion. But I think you've also had, as a guest lecturer, John Mearsheimer, who's very much, who's the American scholar who's very much of the view that NATO brought it upon themselves by not understanding Russian sensitivities, and also that America's national interest is not bound up by Ukraine. I'm not sure exactly what he is recommending we do about it, but he's certainly part of the movement that we see in America, which is now quite vocal inside the Republican Party, which is that whatever the ins and outs of Ukraine, it's not America's problem. It's bound up also with Hunter Biden and the Biden family's links to Ukraine. So they're sort of the poles of the argument, but that's how it looks, as I say, from Melbourne. I'd be very interested in your view on where we are with the war, that it's still very much in progress, hangs in the balance. Everyone's dreadfully worried about it, but the West is struggling for a coherent response at the moment. So what's the view from Hungary on that?
Well, I think it's a tragedy. So the whole war, losing lives, has been tragic. And could we have avoided it? It's a difficult question. I think I personally am somewhere between Mearsheimer and Tony Abbott, seeing some elements where the West could have done better, but also seeing that I'm not sure that actually would have placated the Russians and could have avoided a conflict. But now that we have the conflict, we obviously have to say that what Russia is doing is wrong. Now, coming from that, what is the actual solution to this? That's much more difficult. So I think Hungary, from the very beginning, has been trying to say that, look, what is our end goal here? So when we say we want Ukraine to win, what that means in reality, it means that Ukraine survives. It means they get back the eastern territories, which Russia recently occupied. Does it mean they get back the Crimea? Does it mean they actually defeat Russia and Russia will be decolonized, as some more progressive people were saying? I think we have to have a very clear end goal of this, which I don't think we have. Nobody really knows what Ukraine wins means, because you could make the argument that by just surviving, actually they have already won. But of course, I'm not sure the Ukrainians would like that, because they would lose 20-30% of their territories. My worry is that I just don't see a real end to this conflict. So I would say that if support stays similar as it is now, I just don't see the Ukrainians realistically winning this war, because the Russians have far more resources, both human and every other resource as well. So I think if things stay the same, 5 years, 10 years from now, Russia will win this war. It might be a kind of a very terrible, dreadful thing for both countries, but I just don't see Ukraine winning. So what are the options? We either give them much more. I'm not sure we're willing to give them much more. I'm not meaning here Hungary, but basically the whole Western world. I think there have been countries who are willing, but I would say that most countries have become a bit wary. So I don't really see this as realistic. Also, I don't really think that most people would like the NATO to be more involved, in a sense that sending in soldiers, and that could be dangerous in a sense, because that could escalate the conflict. I think a lot of people, of course, Putin is throwing around with the nuclear threat, and a lot of people say that, okay, that's just threat making and we have to stay strong. But I mean, living quite close to Ukraine, I'm not sure you can completely outrule those things, and actually that makes Russia the biggest threat, that they have a lot of nuclear weapons. Without them, I wouldn't be very much afraid of Russia, because they have a not very efficient economy. Their demographics are also terrible. Yes. Not as terrible as Ukraine now, but still compared to Western Europe, which has terrible demographics, Russia is still worse. But because they have the nuclear weapons, and also I think perhaps they have more of a willingness to fight now, it seems. I think a lot of people hoped that most Russians don't support this war. The Prigozhin uprising was kind of cheered, and a lot of people, I think, thought that Putin can be kind of kicked out of office, or you can have a revolution. I don't really think that's realistic. And also I think
even a year ago that was something that was talked about, and I don't think anyone's really talking about.
But most of the polls, I mean, of course, it's hard to trust those polls coming out of Russia, but in theory, you have some independent polls. All of them show that Putin is actually fairly popular. So I really think that even if they would have proper elections, most likely he would win, which doesn't show that the Russians are getting fed up with this war. And also, I think what is very interesting is that I think a lot of people don't realize that while Putin is pretty terrible, but they are far worse. Yes. So if he's out, I'm not sure we would have a Gorbachev or a Brezhnev. Yeltsin. You can't get somebody far worse.
Yeah. It's also a little bit of a parallel to where we started this discussion on Hungary re-entering history. As the memory of the Soviet era recedes, increasingly the old patterns of Russia are reappearing. I mean, whether it's the Tsars or Putin, geography is destiny almost, and old enmities come back. I mean, we saw that astounding interview that Tucker Carlson did with Putin, where he's like, hang on.
The Russian history lecture. Back
in 813, it was the history doesn't go away, and that. So in that sense, the stoicism of the Russians as they're being thrown into the battlefront is horrifying in a sense. But entirely consistent with what we've seen over centuries and centuries.
Well, this is one of the frustrating things, is that people putting the Ukrainian stickers on their cars, and they have no idea about the history of that part of the world. People in Australia have no idea. Most people haven't been to
I'm not sure
this
they
part
know
of the
where
world.
Ukraine is. I mean,
they wouldn't know where they wouldn't have known where Ukraine was before this all started. There's no understanding of that incredibly complicated geopolitical and historical part of the world.
But also, I think what really matters here is, I mean, it doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. Is how history of Russia, Ukraine has been, what these people believe, and the Russians do believe what Putin was saying in that interview. So I think a vast majority of Russians do believe that at least parts of Ukraine should be part of their country. I mean, we can disagree with it, and it might not be historically factual, but as long as they believe it, it's something you have to deal with, because that gives them strength to continue this process. And also, I think it plays a very crucial role in kind of the Russian psyche, because you had to kind of control the plains. The plains was the part where all the enemies were coming. I mean, the Mongols, the Poles, the Germans, and I think that's why Ukraine has a much more special sense in Russian thinking than, let's say, the Baltics or of course Poland or Hungary, which luckily only briefly were part.
Because that's where the armies come from.
Yes,
that's what Tucker Carlson missed. He said, Russia has so much land, why would they need more land? Well, it's actually about controlling the approaches.
Because they are plains, and it's pretty easy to kind of, as we could see in both world wars, actually, the Germans could pretty easily go once the front has been destroyed.
No, thank you for that perspective. I wanted to say, by the way, to commend to viewers this wonderful magazine, Hungarian Conservative, which is one of the great products of the Institute. And you've been in New Zealand and in Australia. It's traditional in Australian interviews because people come from a long way away to get here. What have been your impressions so far?
Well, I've only been here since Sunday, and most of it was in Sydney. I only arrived to Melbourne yesterday, but actually I have to say I was very impressed. So, of course, I can't really make far-stretching observations from a couple of days, but your city seems impressive in a sense that you seem to be wealthy, you seem to be doing well. Compared to America, your cities are much more cleaner. You don't have as many homeless. I mean, these are just observations. I'm hoping I'm not offending anybody, but I'm very impressed by Australia. I think you're doing far better than, let's say, America or the United Kingdom, even if some of you might not think that. But I think there's great hope for Australia, and what I've seen was very impressive.
Oh, that's nice to hear. We don't necessarily disagree. We probably say it's not because of our governments, but it's in spite of them.
That might be the case.
Correlation is not causation. That's right.
Well, it might be because you had a long Conservative government before the current one. So
indeed.
It still has a shadow.
That's right. We had the Howard Costello government, and then we had Tony Abbott, and then there were a few Liberal Prime Ministers after that where it progressively got worse and worse. But anyway, and here we are. But thank you so much for joining us in the studio today. We're looking forward to a great discussion with the IPA team afterwards. And thanks again for
thank you very much
coming.
For having me.
And, thank you so much. Wonderful.
And to the viewers and listeners at home, thank you for joining us. If you want to find out more about the work of the IPA, see how you can become a member, go to ipa.org.au. We'd love to have you.